Every wizard in Harry Potter showed up to Hogwarts already broken, so I tracked down what happened to every single one of them as kids. Some of these are heartbreaking, and some straight up disturbing. Dolores Umbridge. Dolores Umbridge grew up in a household that was falling apart before she could even pick a side, which for the record, she absolutely did. Her father, Orphid, was a wizard with a dead-end job mopping floors in the Department of Magical Maintenance. Her mother, Ellen, was a muggle. Her younger brother was a squib. Dolores looked at this family portrait and decided the only logical move was to pretend half of it never existed. By 15, the family split clean down the middle. Dolores stayed with her father, and Ellen disappeared back into the muggle world with her son. Dolores never spoke to either of them again. Fun fact, she later pressured her own father into early retirement too, slipping him a small monthly allowance to stay out of sight. Whenever coworkers asked if she was related to that Umbridge who used to mop the floors here, she'd smile sweetly and explain that her deceased father had been a distinguished member of the Wizened Gamut. He was, at that point, very much alive. By 17, she was already described as judgmental, prejudiced, and sadistic, so basically fully formed Dolores. The wizarding world never stood a chance. Hagrid. Hagrid was enormous from day one, which makes sense given that his mother, Fridwulfa, was an actual giantess. She left the family when Hagrid was about 3, apparently deciding that a half-human toddler was too small for her standards, literally. Or maybe she was just afraid she would accidentally sit on him. Fridwulfa went back to the giant colonies and eventually had another son, Hagrid's half-brother Gwarp, who was considered a runt by giant standards and still stood 16 feet tall. Hagrid's father, whose name the wizarding world never bothered to record, was a tiny wizard with a massive heart, who raised his son completely alone. He died during Hagrid's second year at Hogwarts, which meant that by 13, Hagrid had lost his father to death and his mother to indifference long before that. The kid who would eventually care for every dangerous creature on the planet started out the most dangerous looking kid on the playground himself. Gentle, oversized, and with nobody around to explain why the world felt 3 sizes too small. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore spent his earliest years in Mold on the Wold, a quiet village where the biggest excitement was supposed to be the garden gnomes. That changed fast, after his younger sister Ariana was attacked by muggle boys who saw her doing magic. Her powers turned unstable, dangerous to herself and everyone around her. Their father, Percival, retaliated, ended up in Azkaban, and the family name became unspeakable overnight. His mother, Kendra, moved the whole family to Godric's Hollow and locked the doors, figuratively and literally. Albus, the eldest of 3, grew up in a house built on secrecy, where his sister had to stay invisible. His father's name became a closed subject, and his younger brother, Aberforth, coped by getting angry, while Albus coped by getting brilliant. He read his way through every book in the house, mastered subjects years above his level, and was corresponding with the greatest magical minds of the era before he'd even started shaving. By 11, Albus was already the kind of kid who made adults uncomfortable, too smart, too composed, and carrying a household full of secrets behind a perfectly polite smile. Ron Weasley. Ron Weasley was the 6th of 7 children, and by the time he showed up, the Weasley family had already burned through most of its resources, patience, and cupboard space. His parents, Arthur and Molly, raised the entire operation at the Burrow, a house held together with magic, love, and the wizarding equivalent of duct tape, where absolutely nothing was new and everything had a previous owner. Ron's robes were hand-me-downs. His books were hand-me-downs. Even his pet rat Scabbers was inherited from his older brother Percy, a deal that would eventually turn out spectacularly worse than anyone imagined. Bill and Charlie were too old and too far away to matter day to day. Percy, unfortunately, was right there and insufferable. Twins Fred and George treated Ron as a full-time test subject for every prank, hex, and terrible idea they ever cooked up. Basically, Ron arrived at Hogwarts already knowing 2 things with absolute certainty. He was surrounded by people who seemed better at everything, and he was permanently sick of corned beef sandwiches. Gross. Sirius Black. Sirius Black grew up at 12 Grimmauld Place, a gloomy London townhouse stuffed with cursed heirlooms, mounted house elf heads, and a family tapestry that took up an entire wall. His parents, Orion and Walburga, raised Sirius and his younger brother, Regulus, in a house that ran on pure blood obsession, dark artifacts, and Walburga's preferred parenting method. screaming. Family gatherings were worse. Sirius grew up sharing Sunday dinners with cousins like Bellatrix and Narcissa, meaning he was surrounded by future Death Eaters before he could ride a broomstick. His cousin Andromeda was the only relative who didn't make him want to leave the room, and she eventually got blasted off the family tapestry for marrying a Muggle-born, which told young Sirius everything he needed to know about what this family did to people who disagreed. Sirius hated all of it. He was loud, restless, and fundamentally allergic to everything Grimmauld Place stood for. He boarded the Hogwarts Express already itching to be anywhere else, and became the first Black in recorded history to be sorted into Gryffindor, while Berga's portrait is still screaming about it decades later, so imagine the live reaction. Severus Snape. Severus Snape grew up on Spinner's End, a grim little street near a river and a factory chimney, and you can see it in him. His father Tobias was a Muggle with a temper. His mother Eileen Prince was a witch who seemed to have given up on magic and most other things long before Severus came along. The house was tense, neglected, and Snape spent most of his time escaping it. Here's the real gossip. The one bright spot in that whole childhood had nothing to do with his parents. It was Lily Evans, a Muggle-born girl doing accidental magic in the local playground. Snape had been watching her for a while, which sounds unsettling because it slightly was, but he was also a lonely, badly dressed kid who'd finally found someone like him. Lily had no idea what she was. Snape recognized the signs explained everything, the magic, the world behind it, the school they'd both end up at. And just like that, the loneliest kid on Spinner's End had his first real friend. They spent the years before Hogwarts together, talking about the wizarding world, about Hogwarts houses, about everything waiting for them once they turned 11. For a kid whose home life was miserable, Lily Evans was the entire reason the future looked like something worth getting to. Remus Lupin. Remus Lupin was 4 years old when Fenrir Greyback climbed through his bedroom window and bit him. The attack was personal. Remus's father Lyle, a ministry wizard, had publicly insulted werewolves during a hearing, and Greyback took it as an invitation. His mother Hope, a Muggle, had no framework for what her child had become. Lyle, despite being the supposed expert on dark creatures, had none either. The Lupins moved constantly after that, never staying anywhere long enough for neighbors to notice their son's monthly disappearances. Every full moon was a crisis managed in secret, and every new town came with an expiration date built in. Hope and Lyle worked through every healer, rumor, and back alley cure they could find. None of it worked. By the time Dumbledore personally showed up to offer Remus a place at Hogwarts, complete with a plan involving a secret passage and a haunted shack, the family had nearly given up on the idea that their son could have anything resembling a normal life. He arrived at school already fluent in the one subject Hogwarts never taught: how to disappear. James Potter. James Potter had the kind of childhood that makes everyone else's look underfunded. His parents, Fleamont and Euphemia, had him late in life. They'd already given up on children entirely when James arrived, which meant he was raised as the only child of two elderly, wealthy, completely besotted parents, who treated him like a small miracle. Fleamont had made the family fortune by inventing Sleekeasy's hair potion, a product so successful it quadrupled the Potters' already comfortable gold reserves. And the Potters spent generously on their only son. James never wanted for anything, which is exactly how you end up with an 11-year-old who treats Hogwarts like his personal playground. His father also passed down the invisibility cloak before school, which is either a beautiful family tradition or the worst possible gift for a boy with zero respect for boundaries. The Sorting Hat put him in Gryffindor, and by the end of his first week he'd already found Sirius Black, started a lifelong friendship, and made at least 3 enemies: Fred and George Weasley. Fred and George Weasley were born on April 1st, April Fool's Day, and the wizarding world has been dealing with the consequences ever since. Third and fourth of Arthur and Molly's 7 children, they were wedged between rule-obsessed Percy and long-suffering Ron, which gave them both a permanent target and a willing test subject. The twins were pulling pranks before they could read, had already mapped every hidden corner of the burrow by age 7, and once tried to get their younger brother Ron to make an unbreakable vow, which would have been funny right up until the part where it killed him. Their father Arthur walked in just in time and was reportedly furious. One of the rare moments in Weasley history where Arthur genuinely lost his temper. Classic Weasley chaos. 2 kids who turned troublemaking into a vocation before their letters even arrived. Hermione Granger. Hermione Granger read the entire syllabus syllabus before the first day of school, and that was just primary school. She was the kid who corrected teachers mid-sentence, finished tests first, and spent every break alone with a book because the other kids had decided she was insufferable years ago. Her parents, both dentists, had zero connection to the magical world, which meant that when her Hogwarts letter arrived, the whole family was starting from scratch. Most Muggle-born kids would panic. Hermione went book shopping. She bought every title on the recommended list, then extras, then read them all before September. By the time she boarded the Hogwarts Express, she could recite Hogwarts, a history from memory, and casually correct people on wand movements she'd only read about in theory. Her parents, meanwhile, were reportedly proud and mildly terrified, which feels like the correct response when your 11-year-old announces she's leaving for a castle to study spells. Minerva McGonagall. Minerva McGonagall's childhood came with a built-in lesson about secrets, courtesy of her own mother. Her father, Robert, was a Muggle, a Presbyterian minister in Scottish Highlands. Her mother, Isabel Ross, was a witch who fell in love, married him, and then spent years hiding her magic because she couldn't bring herself to tell her husband the truth. Quick note, Isabel only revealed herself after baby Minerva started doing things no minister's daughter should do. Summoning toys, making objects rearrange themselves, the usual signs. Robert took the news about as well as you'd expect. The marriage held, but the warmth drained out of it. Minerva grew up in a house where magic was treated as a problem to be managed. Her mother's quiet sadness colored every room, and the cost of loving a Muggle shone up over breakfast. By the time her Hogwarts letter arrived, Minerva had already absorbed the principle that would define her entire career. Never hide what you are, and never let anyone else feel they have to. Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle was born in London Orphanage on New Year's Eve 1926, and things went downhill from there. His mother, Merope Gaunt, gave birth, named him, and died within the hour, leaving behind a baby and absolutely nothing else. His father was a wealthy Muggle from Little Hangleton who'd been kept under a love potion by Merope and walked away the moment it wore off. Translation, Tom started life rejected by every branch of his own family tree. The orphanage staff figured out early that something was wrong. Young Tom could move objects without touching them, hurt other children when provoked, command animals, and had a particular habit of collecting stolen trophies from kids he'd frightened, hidden in his wardrobe like souvenirs. He once terrified 2 orphans in a seaside cave during a day trip, and the matron spoke about him with visible unease to anyone who asked. By the time Dumbledore showed up with his Hogwarts letter, Tom was 11 years old and already the scariest person in the building. Neville Longbottom. Neville Longbottom's story usually starts with Bellatrix Lestrange, but before that, there was actually something worth losing. He was born to 2 of the most respected Aurors in the Ministry, Frank and Alice Longbottom, and for a brief shining window, everything was exactly as it should have been. A healthy baby, a loving family, 2 parents who'd already proven they could survive the worst the wizarding world had to offer. Then the worst came for them anyway. Shortly after Voldemort's first fall, Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabaston, and Barty Crouch Jr. tortured Frank and Alice into permanent insanity. Neville was a toddler. He was raised by his paternal grandmother Augusta, a formidable witch with a vulture-topped hat and zero tolerance for weakness, which was tricky because Neville's childhood showed almost no signs of magic at all. The family was quietly terrified he might be a squib. He visited his parents at St. Mungo's regularly, though neither of them could recognize him. Neville arrived at Hogwarts with his father's old wand, a toad named Trevor that kept escaping, and more courage than he'd ever given himself credit for. Draco Malfoy. Draco was raised at Malfoy Manor by his father Lucius, a former Death Eater with political connections, old money, and the bearing of a man who'd never once carried his own bags, and his mother Narcissa née Black, which meant Draco inherited pure-blood ideology from both sides with no competing influences. The household ran on status, appearances, and a very clear ranking system of who mattered. Lucius taught Draco to see the world as a hierarchy, and to make sure everyone knew the Malfoys were at the top of it. Narcissa, meanwhile, just wanted her son safe, which produced a kid caught between 2 very different kinds of love, one that demanded performance and one that demanded nothing. Draco learned to sneer, to rank people by bloodline, to parrot his father's opinions so early it all looked natural, but the cruelty was always borrowed, never really his. By the time Draco boarded the Hogwarts Express, he was already name-dropping his father to strangers, sneering at second-hand robes and sorting people into categories by bloodline. 11 years old and already a fully operational Malfoy, expensive, entitled, and deeply convinced that the world owed him priority seating. Luna Lovegood. Luna Lovegood grew up in a house near Ottery St. Catchpole that looked like it could topple over at any moment, and honestly it probably could. Her father, Xenophilius, editor of the Quibbler, raised her surrounded by dirigible plum bushes, butterbeer cork wind chimes, and a magazine dedicated to creatures and conspiracies that mainstream wizards politely pretended were nonsense. Her mother, Pandora, was a brilliant experimental witch who let Luna help in the kitchen, encouraged every impossible question, and made the Lovegood household feel like the one place where being strange was a compliment. Then, when Luna was 9, Pandora pushed a spell too far and something went catastrophically wrong. Luna saw the whole thing. Xenophilius raised Luna alone after that, in the same peculiar house, with the same impossible conversations, except now grief lived quietly underneath all the wonder. Luna arrived at Hogwarts gentle, strange, painfully sincere, and entirely immune to peer pressure, partly because Xenophilius raised her to question everything, and partly because she'd already survived the worst thing a child can survive. Other kids called her loony. She never seemed to mind, which somehow made it sadder. Ginny Weasley, the only daughter and youngest of Arthur and Molly's 7 children. Ginny grew up at the Burrow, outnumbered, underestimated, and completely unfazed by both. With Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, and Ron already filling every room in the house, she learned early that the only way to get heard was to be louder, faster, or more stubborn than all of them. Her brothers taught her to fly in secret. Molly would have lost her mind, and Ginny had been sneaking into the broom shed since she was 6, borrowing brooms that technically belonged to people who didn't know she could ride. She also grew up hearing stories about Harry Potter, the boy who survived Voldemort, and developed a mortifying, fully debilitating hero crush long before she'd ever met him. Well, spoiler, she eventually married him, making her the only person in Hogwarts whose childhood fantasy held up to reality. Ginny arrived at Hogwarts already capable of a solid bat boogie hex, and barely able to string a sentence together around Harry. The hex held up better. Harry Potter, the future husband of Ginny Weasley, spent the first 10 years of his life in a cupboard under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive, wearing his cousin Dudley's oversized hand-me-downs and believing his parents had died in a car crash. His aunt Petunia, his mother Lily's older sister, and her husband Vernon raised Harry the way you'd raise an inconvenient house guest you couldn't legally return. Their actual son Dudley got 2 bedrooms, mountains of birthday presents, way too much food, and full permission to use Harry as target practice. Harry got chores, leftovers, and a thorough education in what it feels like to be unwanted. Strange things kept happening around him. Hair that grew back overnight, a teacher's wig turning blue, somehow landing on a school rooftop, but nobody ever explained any of it, and asking questions was actively discouraged. Meanwhile, the entire wizarding world knew everything about him: the name, the scar, the parents who died for him. The Dursleys spent weeks destroying letters, boarding up the mail slot, and eventually fleeing to a shack on the rock in the sea, all to stop an 11-year-old from finding out that he was the most famous wizard of his generation. It didn't work. Now you know what shaped every witch and wizard before Hogwarts. But what happened to them after the Deathly Hallows? That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before Umbridge finds a reason to give you all detention for loitering.